Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and on behalf of the Institute and our event sponsor, the Latvian Ministry of Defense, I'd like to welcome you to this special panel event called An Enduring Commitment, Transatlantic Security and Canada's Mission in the Baltics. And let me draw your attention, to those of you who are technologically minded, to the fact that we have hashtags and all the information you need on the screen there on the right side of the room in case you want to tweet about today's discussions. Thanks very much for being here. As you might know, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute has been in the forefront of discussion on NATO's defense of the Baltics, as well as the larger question of NATO's northern and eastern flank with Russia. With 450 troops stationed in Latvia, Canada has a key role in this defense of freedom, and it is important, we think, for Canadians to understand the rationale for the presence of Canadian troops on the ground at that fragile frontier with Russia. We're also approaching the one-year anniversary when the Canadian-led battle group in Latvia was finally stood up as part of Canada's Operation Reassurance. It's therefore, we think, an ideal time to remind ourselves about the logic behind the mission, particularly about the importance of European and Baltic security, and the need to demonstrate to the United States the commitment of its allies to NATO. Canada should therefore, in our view, be in for the long haul. The possible risks inherent in this mission, of course, also cannot be ignored. What happens if little green men cross the border and engage in combat with Canadian or NATO troops, leading to Canadian casualties? What is Canada's response if, or we should say when, we become the target of a disinformation operation? Indeed, it would be further disinformation, since Canada's mission has already been mischaracterized by Russian trolls, but on a relatively small scale. In such circumstances, how do we ensure that Canada's commitment to Latvia, the Baltics, and NATO more broadly continues to be unwavering? As part of our efforts to work with the Canadian public to raise the profile and understanding of both the importance and the associated risks of this mission, we're pleased to bring together some of the leading thinkers in Canada and the United States on NATO and Canada's military mission to Latvia to discuss these vitally important issues. I should also note, by the way, that this event is only the first in a larger project exploring the need to stand guard on the NATO frontier with Russia. In this context, we will be creating a platform for leading experts on such topics as Canada's mission to Latvia, Russia's hybrid warfare strategy, and how NATO should respond, and an examination of the dangers of Russian disinformation campaigns. Indeed, I'm delighted to say that one of our newest senior fellows, Alexander Moens from Simon Fraser University, who is a key contributor to this project, will be speaking on these issues at a separate event in Riga this Friday. I'd again like to thank the Latvian Ministry of Defense for their generous support in sponsoring this event, and I want to welcome two special guests. We have many special guests today, not least the ambassador from Estonia, who we're delighted is gracing us with her presence. But I want to mention two special guests to today's event. The Latvian ambassador, of course, Carlos Eenbaums, and Parliamentary Secretary Andrew Leslie, both of whom have taken time out of their busy schedule to attend today's event. And before I leave the rest of our event to our moderator, Shuv Majumdar, whom I'm assuming will show up eventually, I understand that first the ambassador and then the parliamentary secretary would like to say a few words. So I'm going to turn the platform over first to Ambassador Eenbaums. He's a great friend of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and has been Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary. Wouldn't you love to have the title? Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Latvia. Awesome. I've never had a title that good. He's been here since 2016, and before that held a number of key positions in the Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as ambassador to the Netherlands, Estonia, and Israel. And the ambassador has said he'd like to speak for about 10 minutes. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I remember our last meeting, it was in December, when basically we discussed possibilities to organize the events like this. And I'm happy to see a relatively big crowd. And it shows your interest not only in Canada, but also in Latvia and probably even in the wider world. When we met last time, we talked about Canada and the security challenges it faces. Many of them are shared with the wider world, including Baltics. With Canadian deployment to Latvia and the ongoing presence in Ukraine, Canada is helping countries like my own deal with new threats and dangers aimed at the heart of Western values, rule of law and democratic governments. In Warsaw in 2016, NATO leaders gave the signal to put our guards up more visibly so that no one in their right mind could be tempted to test what alliance is made of. As a result, many NATO countries deployed their troops in Latvia and the region. I would call this solidarity in action. Latvia is a home away from home for many Canadian and allied troops. Actually, number of Canadians in Latvia is exactly 100 more than you mentioned, not including the family members. And we are very happy for this Canadian presence from all aspects. The mainstream of Latvia's society full-heartedly welcomes them with open arms. A recent poll showed that nearly half of the people living in Latvia believe that the country's security has improved compared to what it was back in 2015. Canada's deployment directly supports Latvia and our neighbors Estonia and Lithuania. It also benefits others who are clustered along the shores of the Baltic Sea, like Poland, Germany, Denmark, Norway, and even non-NATO partners like Sweden and Finland. It was so important that all NATO countries stepped up, responding in this critical moment for maintaining our law-based world order. This move keeps NATO strong when NATO will have to arm itself with new approaches as it prepares to face off against new kinds of opponents. Opponents that recognize that the information space is a prime target. Opponents that are ready to fight dirty, no holds barred. We can talk a lot about holding strategic locations on the ground, in Ukraine, somewhere in the Middle East, or even Gotland in Sweden. But we are equally concerned about the influence projected through traditional media outlets and social media, and with what our citizens and even some politicians manage to hear and read as they flip through the channels. It is concerning because what happens in that space can not only change the map, but also shape political landscapes and alter election results. Let's consider the message of battle group, embedded in our battle group itself. The message is that we are multinational in character. I can count more than 2/3 of the 29 countries in NATO joining the 4 battle groups in Baltic states and Poland. Even the newest member, Montenegro, is on its way, and this number is growing. Very powerful message indeed. Mr. Chairman, perceived weakness is almost as bad as real weakness. Those who perceive weakness are tempted to exploit it. And this is undoubtedly true in times when there are conscious attempts to shift the position of the goalposts and sow tension. Latvia will pull its weight. We are not taking Canadian or any another ally's generosity for granted. We are doing our part. We had already reached 2% of GDP on defense spending. We are investing in radar, sensors, and other equipment that boost our situational awareness. More should and will be done. We are training intensively with our friends, and we are adapting. Latvia has been present in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in the Mediterranean, in Mali, in Central African Republic, and off the coast of Somalia. And Latvians are proud of these soldiers, the ones that go out where the trouble is and the ones that are holding the fort. 73% of respondents said they were very proud of our soldiers. Russia's aggressive posture is part of how we come to such a pass. Still, we want one day to come out on the other side with Russia realizing that it's gained nothing from playing the bully, for putting sanctions on our products, on our fish and dairy products, or cement or building materials. We want Russia to realize that a good neighbor is as important as faraway friend, and sometimes more important. Ultimately, Russia should realize that the liberty of its people and the openness of its society is a useful thing to have. We want Russia to get life, to get back on track. Meanwhile, we are stuck trying to live with Russia's dangerous bullying, hybrid warfare, and other tactics. The country's partners use chemical weapons, and it makes casual assertions about their using nuclear weapons. It is a disturbing pattern of behavior. And the lack of collective NATO response could be seen as an invitation, a green light. We have not always been so awake. We brushed aside the rocket attacks in Grozny, the war in Georgia. Europe and the rest of the world did its best to ignore what was going on until the conquest of Ukraine. Crimea fell 4 short years ago. So much has changed since then. We face a combination of older games and the newer games in the information space where state-controlled media are impacting how people understand the news, sowing doubts and muddling the truth so much that even well-educated people become disoriented. We have seen how efficient Russia's information war has been to promote a certain narrative, which is anti-globalization, anti-NATO, and so on. How worried should we be that this propaganda war can start to take hold in places like Canada if we are not vigilant? Russia Today, now rebranded as RT, or certain so-called local experts, are just few examples of a propaganda vehicle already embedded in Canada. Russia is and it will be trying to promote the message, stay away from their legitimate historical spheres of interest, emphasizing the concept that an uncertainty flows from the ways in which the society is not perfectly integrated. Russia is asserting that the ethnic Russians living in Latvia and other Baltic states are divided from the rest of the population, and that Latvians, Estonians, and Lithuanians are pro-Western bias. The Kremlin will ensure that the state-sponsored media conveys the sense that Canadians and Canada are getting involved and entangled in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that it would be better if they concentrated on hockey, and that's it. The main target is the Canadian public and not Latvians in Latvia. People like Peskov, Kisilyov, Solovyov, Simoyan, Zakharova, and some more well-known propagandists and masters of disinformation for whom propaganda is second nature know all too well that Latvians are strong and that we have learned our lessons from history. This is a kind of thing you already can see from articles appearing even in serious Canadian media outlets. So, RT, Sputnik, and their puppets are specifically targeting Canadians and working to undermine their determination, interest, and commitment with regard to NATO and with regard to support for the battle group in Latvia. Russia was already massing military manpower and hardware on the edge of peaceful Europe prior to NATO's decision to enhance its forward presence on the eastern periphery. The decision on the force battle groups came after Russia's decision to place 3 new divisions near NATO's eastern flank. NATO's assurance measures are a response to Russia's behavior and not vice versa. The Russian propaganda machine tried to promote the feeling that we in the Baltics are isolated and that we will be left out alone in the cold, but they have been totally wrong. Many countries have wanted to come to the Baltics, and Poland and more are joining. And there is a certain desperation in the Russian leadership's psyche as they see that this narrative is not gaining traction and time is running out. They thought that Ukraine would fall. But on the contrary, Ukraine is becoming strong. The Ukrainians are pulling themselves together. They are consolidating, uniting, and engaging in what might be called late nation building. The Russian leadership made a strategic mistake when they turned this great state and people against them. A nation with a population larger than Canada, I suspect that Ukrainians will be turned against Russia for a very, very long time to come, given the suffering that they have experienced. Despite the hostile attitude, NATO has nevertheless stood by a two-track approach in dealing with Russia. Deterrence and dialogue, the two go together. We must show that Article 5 is real and to be reckoned with, that it truly means all for one and one for all. We want potential adversaries to know that the battle group represents a set of force with depth and dimension. We all can be targeted, and this is one of the aims, to make us worried and to cause us to live in fear if they can, because that would alter our behavior in a manner conducive to appeasement and passivity. Another thing to keep in mind, Canadian troops are not only on NATO territory, but also on European Union territory. The efforts of the European Union and NATO should be mutually reinforcing. For those institutions to be working in tandem would be good any time of the year or the decade. But it is absolutely crucial when we are addressing hybrid threats. In this process of making everything and everyone work together so that we come out stronger and better on the other side of the challenges, it made so much sense that a country like Canada has chosen to lead. Recent polls prove that Latvians in Latvia see themselves as connected with Canada and drawn to it, as a land that gave refuge to their relatives, as a land of promise, and because of Canadians are outgoing, friendly, and tough. Also, hockey is the answer given the most. A full third of respondents in polls thought hockey when they were thinking of Canada. But most Latvians did not think of beavers when they thought about Canada. We have plenty of beavers in Latvia and will be ready to export them if you are run short. Dear friends, the military art is geared toward avoiding wars and preserving peace, but at the same time, military history proves that we must be ready to protect ourselves. The NATO summit in Brussels next month will continue the work started in the summits in Wales and particularly in Warsaw. We look forward to strengthen those decisions. Together we are united in our resolve to protect alliance territories and prevent conflict. We welcome Canada's contribution to Euro-Atlantic defense and feel good that Latvia is a host country for the Canadian-led battle group. From Latvia's perspective, the transatlantic bond is intrinsic to European defense. There is no substitute for this bond, and Canada's presence in Latvia is strengthening that bond and strengthening the peace in our peace-loving Baltic Sea region. Thank you.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to call on Parliamentary Secretary Andrew Leslie. Andrew enjoyed, of course, a decorated 35-year career with the Canadian Armed Forces before retiring in 2011. Since then, he was elected a Member of Parliament in October 2015 and is currently Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs with responsibility for Canada-US relations. And if I can frighten my colleagues by going off script for a moment, let me say something that I know will be taken in good part by Mr. Leslie because he understands the constructive spirit in which it is offered. If I had the Canada-US relations file right now, I would seek refuge in a conference about the Baltics too. And I say this knowing that the government's handling of this file has been very deft and thoughtful and deserves the support of Canadians. Apparently, the message from the White House these days is that if you want something from America, don't be a longtime ally, close trading partner, and generally the best friend America has in the world. Instead, be a Stalinist gulag and threaten America with nuclear holocaust. Okay. It is to weep. Perhaps, Andrew, when you go to D.C., you can quote Ambassador Inbaum's, "Good neighbors are as important as distant friends, and maybe even more so."
Thank you. You know, I spent 4 years with a great team running your army. And I got a little bit of advice in that job, but it's amazing how much advice I get in the one I have now. I want to tell you a story. First of all, Ambassador, thank you for being here, and thanks for the great work you and your team have done, and will always do in terms of articulating the needs, especially of a far-reaching, visionary Canada that is resurgent. But let me tell you a story. Let me set the scene for a young Canadian about to join the armed forces. There's a bit of friction and sort of a nexus, a confluence of activities and tensions between either good or bad, Russia, China, and the US. Bit of friction on some trade issues involving steel and aluminum and cars. Economy's doing really well, though. One of the leaders in the G7, the unemployment rate pretty low. The trade volumes have increased year over year. Our education has produced a viable workforce, and our soldiers have a reputation second to none. The equipment is pretty good. Relatively new tanks are being used wherever I'm about to talk about. Relatively new guns, relatively new armored personnel carriers. And so this young Canadian joins the Canadian Armed Forces, goes through superb training, deploys overseas, and gets to go and work as part of an integrated battle group, helping European friends face off a resurgent bear, this growly. And here we are. Of course, you know I'm talking about 1980, right? I'm talking about me when I joined. So the wheel keeps ticking around that old clock. 1980, here we are. Now, the geopolitical context and the nexus of change is accelerating, but there's eerie similarities between what happened then and now. So in 1980, which is pre-NAFTA, there were some squabbles. In 1980, don't forget what was going on between Russia, China, and the United States. In 1980s, don't forget that the Russians were very adept at using, I'm going to get it wrong, Eleanor. By the way, of the 3 people on stage, or the 4 people on stage, I've worked for 3 of them, either academically as part of a soldier or whatever else I was doing in life. They're adept at intimidation, using cyber attack. Of course, the precursor to that was videos of all sorts of unpleasant things or listening to your phones. And it was called Mastrovoika. Eleanor, can you help me out here? There's a Russian... Thank you. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is this is a very timely discussion, but there's lots of lessons to be learned from history. Not international history, our history. There's lots of good lessons we can extract and learn from to help us better help those who need our help. 3 helps in 1 sentence. And right now, it is those border states with Russia with which we seek to constrain a bear. I was also going to mention as part of my introductory remarks, oh, and by the way, Russia had recently invaded a country, but I thought amongst the historians, you'd get it right away, because of course that was Afghanistan. This last time's around, in the recent past, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine and elsewhere. So thank you for what you do. We can contribute. We are contributing. We're not going anywhere. We believe in what we're doing in Latvia. We believe in actually the NATO alliance. And we're going to be there for those countries that need us most. We're not shy about deploying. Our troops are well equipped. They are superbly trained. And they're full of resolve. And they're doing a great job training others in the region who are part of that integrated battle group in the larger command structure. And we're a friend and ally you can rely on. And in that context, I'm going to stop talking. I think we have about 1.5 minutes for questions, if that.
Well, I think we can, the Parliamentary Secretary has kindly agreed to answer a couple of questions. Unfortunately, he can't stay till the end when we have the Q&A, so I've set aside a few minutes for questions from the audience that the Parliamentary Secretary could respond to.
And one of the big reasons why I came here, so I wouldn't have to talk about Canada-US. Hint.
He left that job to me. Ladies and gentlemen, questions for the Parliamentary Secretary? Yes.
Name's Tobias Fisher. I suppose it's not about Canada and the United States directly, but we saw yesterday the president basically throw South Korea under the bus and cancel these military exercises. Is there a concern that the United States may do the same thing with NATO and Eastern Europe? If the president's talking about, we want to bring our troops home, how much consternation does that cause in NATO? If they want to bring their troops home from Asia, is it conceivable they'll want to start bringing their troops home from Europe as well?
Right. I would refer you to what General Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis, has said on numerous occasions in his various fora, most recently in Eastern Europe, but specifically within NATO countries. And General Mattis fully recognizes the value of NATO, and he has said so publicly. So has the president, as you may recall. Initially, he had a different perspective during the election, but of course, perceptions do change once you're elected and you can get access to the full picture. The whole idea of providing stability, especially in that part of the world, is one of paramount importance, and historically, the Secretary of Defense and others like him have been incredibly supportive. Well, I'm not going to comment on the President of the United States, quite frankly. And I'll tell you why, because it's time to lower the temperature, right? It's all step back, ice water in our veins, calm, cool, collected, and much akin to my 1980s parallel. Don't forget what happened then.
Other questions for the Parliamentary Secretary? Yes.
Oh, hi, Kurt Egla. This question is from behind the wire. My son is there with the first deployment, the first regiment, Canadian Horse. And unfortunately, though, that from his point of view, the equipment is still much the same as in 1980. So he's wondering whether
It was only relatively new then.
system interoperability, do you think we'll be going to self-propelled artillery at some point and fit in with the rest of NATO and advance the equipment?
Okay, I'm deliberately not going to ask your son's name. But let me just talk about the equipment. So the Leopard 2s, which have just essentially come off the refurbishment line, so they're brand spanking new. And they have the most amongst the most sophisticated fire control systems, especially for the tank-to-tank role. And great belly protection on the bottom, which is why we could send them down the road first in Afghanistan. They take the hit instead of the LAVs. The light armored vehicles, the LAV-6, have rolled off the production line. Those are being replaced. The reconnaissance version of the LAV is literally the best in the world. And I believe that the artillery is equipped with the 777. 777 you can pick up and move by helicopter. It weighs less than 10,000 pounds. It's a lot more expensive than a self-propelled M109, on which I had the privilege of serving for about 25 years. Its belly thickness is about that. So, and it's full of, it carries about 54 high explosive rounds of 100 pounds each. So if something goes boom on the bottom, the whole thing's going to go bang. We don't want to go back to self-propelled guns because we don't need to. And the technology is such as that we can push a bullet out to somewhere close to 45 kilometers with a circular error probability of about 55 to 60 meters. We can actually fly a bullet through someone's window using the laser-guided system. All that technology is available over there. So, by the way, I'm a gunner. So I could talk about this for hours. But I do, no, I will. But one key fact is the artillery is the elite of the Army, so I congratulate your son on his regimental choice. I'm just looking at the infantry in the room.
Well, I was going to say, the infantry is the...
Yeah, here we go.
All right, so it's not, and you're still Canadian Global Affairs, or one-time reservist as well. Question about the dialogue side of deterrence and dialogue. So, I mean, on Monday, there was a meeting of foreign ministers of Ukraine, Russia, France and Germany, and they keep pushing the Minsk stuff because there is that dialogue element. Our troops can be there and they're holding the line, which is great, but at some point there's got to be a resolution. You've spoken about that. What's Canada playing in that? I mean, where's our foreign policy interests dialogues, like the OSCE, for example, and then there's a lot of talk about the potential structure a peacekeeping framework that might go into Ukraine one day if everyone agrees. Are we playing in that role? Are we interested in participating in that?
So I'm sorry to say that my knowledge or my focus has been pretty laser-like on Canada-US. I don't know the answer to that. Help? Can you help? No. So I owe you an answer. But I'll tell you what, there's a really smart person from Global Affairs here right now who is frantically taking notes, and she will get back to you within 48 hours? Less, with an hour. 30 days? Well, I'll tell you what, I know she will do it because she's very, very good at her job, so I'm absolutely confident it will be sorted out. I'm sorry not to be able to answer the last question, but I do now have to go because I have to get back to my other job. And thank you very much for not asking any questions about my other job.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's a great start to our event. I'm now going to call on Monk Senior Fellow at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Shuvaloy Majumdar, who was in the back of the room, to come to the podium, introduce our distinguished panelists, and moderate this morning's discussion. Over to you, Shu.
Okay. You'll forgive my voice today. I've been battling a bit of a cold that I picked up about a couple of days ago, but I'll push through. But before I begin, I'm going to relieve some of our panelists from sitting on the stage for the next 20 minutes or so. Perhaps what I could do is suggest if all of our panelists could grab some chairs in the front, you can be comfortable, and I'll call you back up on stage as is appropriate. There we go. We'll relieve them of that pressure. I'm working on the air conditioner. We'll see what we can do on the weather. I agree with you. It's a bit warm in here. Dr. Joel Sokolsky is a professor of political science at the Royal Military College of Canada. He is also a senior fellow at the Queen's University Centre for International and Defence Studies Policy at the university. And holds an appointment with the Queen's Department of Political Studies. He is a research affiliate at the Strategic Studies program at MIT and is also co-author of one of the papers to be released very soon as part of MLI's project, Standing Guard on NATO's Frontier with Russia. So Dr. Sokolsky, please. Thank you. Come on up.
First of all, I apologize for my phone going off. Believe it or not, that is my first smartphone. My daughter said I have finally entered the 21st century, but I haven't mastered turning it off and on yet. Secondly, I'd like to thank the Institute, the Latvian government for sponsoring this talk, this session, and I speak on behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Christian Leubrecht and Mr. Jason Darrow. I'm going to talk about how Canada got into this commitment, why it got in, and where the future might be going for Canada's involvement. I think in terms of where Canada started its road to Latvia, this would go back to 1949 and the founding of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, the story, as retold by the late, great United States Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, is that as the treaty was being signed, the U.S. Marine Band struck up selections from George Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. It ain't necessarily so, and I got plenty of nothing. And the Secretary thought those were perhaps realistic but inappropriate selections for the signing of a solemn pact. For the Canadians present, also present at creation, they had no doubts that this was good for Canada, good for the Western world, and that Canada wanted to have a role in this new organization. That twice in the first half of the 20th century, Canada had gone to war to prevent Europe from being dominated by a single power, and did not want to go again. So the commitment was consistent with Canadian foreign policy, a foreign policy which from even before the founding of the country had described Canadian security and defense interest in broad global terms. First through the British Empire, then in alliance with the United States. And this, of course, led Canada to deploy substantial forces in Europe in the 1950s. Air forces, ground forces, but more importantly, to make major commitments to European security. And all this took place within a framework of an overall United States foreign policy, which has now been called, and in some cases lament that it may be going away, liberal internationalism, a broad commitment of the United States to European security and to security in Europe. And Canada played a role during those years, in addition to its role in North American security. And underlying this military commitment was a commitment to values, as reaffirmed by Lester Pearson during those years. And throughout the Cold War, Canada maintained forces in Europe for that sake, and subscribed largely to the Allied policy. Now, over the years, the relative size of the Canadian contribution in hard terms declined relative to other allies as they rebuilt, and as the percentage of gross domestic product in the federal budget devoted to defense declined. And I only mention this because, in some sense, this was inevitable given the changes, but also this would become a matter of debate in Canada, criticism from within Canada and out about how much Canada was spending on defense. Some smart aleck people called it a Walmart approach to defense spending, but overall, Canada maintained a consistent commitment, and more importantly, it was a commitment overseas in Europe, reflecting Canadian national security interests. Now, what's, I think, interesting is that when the Cold War ended, one could argue the Canadian commitment to European security actually increased. Despite the withdrawal of the standing forces from Europe in 1993, Canada was heavily involved in the events in the former Yugoslavia. In fact, at one point, Canadian forces in Yugoslavia approximated those that had been in Germany, and then the Cold War ended. So Canada had continued its commitment to European security into the post-Cold War era, in Bosnia, then in Kosovo, and then after 9/11, a major Canadian commitment, including through NATO, to Afghanistan. Now, again, I mention this because there is a tendency to accuse Canada of laggardism, of not sharing the burden, measured somehow solely in terms of percentage of GDP devoted to defense. But the Canadian commitment to NATO indicates that when NATO needs something, whether it's boots on the ground or diplomatic support, Canada, I won't say has punched above your weight. Nobody gets into a ring where the category is above your weight. But Canada has made itself known and has, I think, not been the free rider that it is often accused of. In this background, it's then not surprising that when the call came out from NATO, based on a political consensus within the alliance, Canada responded with a significant contribution, both in terms of boots on the ground and in terms of leadership of the commitment in the framework commitment in Latvia. So in some sense, this is not surprising. As we suggest in the text, what would have been surprising is if Canada had not gone to Latvia when the call went out. Canada is not often conspicuous by its presence, but it is sometimes conspicuous by its absence. And had Canada not deployed, that would have been a conspicuous event. Why specifically? First of all, as we point out, Canada has the capability. You've heard from General Leslie that it's not as bad as the popular vision. It has a professional armed forces, which is widely respected around the world, and Canada was specifically asked for to make a contribution by its allies. So it's then a new government had come into office in 2015 with suggestions about reorienting Canadian defense policy, somehow perhaps emphasizing more collective security through the UN. But as often happens, governments make decisions on the basis of what has to be done immediately. And in this case, a request had come from Canada's close allies. Forgive a pun, that request trumped other opportunities that the government might have been looking for to use the armed forces. As Henry Kissinger said in his 2 pages on Canada, in his 3-volume memoir, Canadian instinct in favor of the common defense has always superseded any tendency to stay above the battle as some kind of international arbiter. So the Canadian commitment was fully consistent with Canada's history. It was also one which, despite reductions in the increase in defense spending, the Canadian government could afford. So the stars aligned, and even before the new white paper had come out, we had made a major commitment which was going to define defense policy for a few years, which is also a Canadian tradition, that you make the decisions before you write the policy and fit the policy to make the decisions. But in this case, it wasn't that hard. NATO had been at the core of Canadian defense policy. Now, what about the future? Well, here, despite Yogi Berra's warning that one should never make predictions, especially about the future, I'm going to suggest 3 alternative futures that may condition the current Canadian commitment. The first future is that things do, as General Leslie said, sort of calm down. The Russians will continue to muck about in Eastern Europe, but there will be no major escalation. NATO has made its commitment known. The alliance, despite its fissures, will hold together, and Canada will renew its commitment as asked for in 2019, and the world will move on perhaps to a more stable relationship. The alliance which will hold together, and the Canadian policy will be a success. That's the future I think most people would prefer, including the government. The second future is that things do not go well between the West and Russia. The American national security strategy has indicated great power conflict as the major organizing principle. The United States Undersecretary Mattis has clearly indicated its commitment to the alliance and to strengthening Europe in general. There are new talks, cooperation between non-member nations such as Sweden and Finland and the United States. You have American Marines now cycling through a base in Norway, which had not allowed foreign troops on its soil. And the United States then, in the event that Russia does continue to up its game, makes an increased commitment to the enhanced forward presence in NATO in particular. And that's good for Canada because it reaffirms the commitment both to Europe and the United States, although it may come with a higher price tag. Canadians worry when they're not asked, and they worry when they're asked too specifically to send things. But in that case, burden sharing would cost a little more. The third alternative future, which may affect, is something for which we've already heard a question from the audience, but in fact is a consideration which is long-standing. And this is that despite the fact that of the current American commitment, which, by the way, even though it's major, the United States has other things. The Secretary Madison himself said that the focus is on the Asia-Pacific. That was until recently. And so in this scenario, the policies of President Trump do not represent the idiosyncrasies of one particular man, one particular president, but a return to a much older U.S. foreign policy. We talk about the tradition as America supporting the liberal international order, collective defense, the multilateralism in foreign economic policy. But the older American tradition, dating back prior to the Second World War, which is not isolationism, which is more unilateralism, reemerges. And it's interesting to note, and this is something we are looking at in terms of the paper, when the Cold War ended in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were a few articles, such as by Alan Tollinson in the New Republic, Michael Clough in Foreign Affairs, which said, this is the end of internationalism. Without a consistent Soviet-Chinese threat, there is no need for America to lead in the West. There is no need to organize the international economic system. This is also reflected in Graham Allison's recent article in Foreign Affairs, that basically the liberal international order was just another means of containing the Soviet Union and Russia, but absent that, there was no need. And this included not only hawkish internationalists who wanted more military and containment and deterrence, but the more liberal versions that wanted the United States to dedicate more to the UN and soft power. As Tollinson argued in 1989, all internationalists will be disappointed by the end of the Cold War. America will return to, as he argued then, a 19th century model in which the United States flourished well. There were other great powers, but America was secure, and America was prosperous, and it dealt with whoever it had to deal with at the moment without guaranteeing the security of countries which offered very little to the United States. So in this future, NATO will decline as an importance for the United States, and because in this view, that should have been the end at the end of the Cold War. Now, initially, in this view, it was derailed because infused with the notions of the end of history and the unipolar world, the Clinton administration went on to engagement and enlargement, including the enlargement of NATO, much to the chagrin of people like George F. Kennan. Why do it? Then when President George W. Bush was running for office, you recall that he called for a more humble U.S. foreign policy, less engagement. That lasted until 9/11. And then again, this sort of return to an earlier version of American foreign policy was put off. But now, in this view, and it's just an alternative future, the United States does return to a less than active engagement. In this sense, as somebody wrote this morning about South Korea, the Baltics are not in our neighborhood. They're a little far. And in this scenario, if the United States does step back from the alliance, let the Europeans handle it. Why not? It would pose a problem for Canada. As Charles Durand said, Canada looks at the world through the prism of its relations with the United States. the United States looks at Canada through the prism of its global relations. In this sense, Canada, if in fact it was the responsibility for security in the eastern part of the alliance, in the EU, was handed over to the Europeans, it would pose a problem for Canada. Could Canada enlist under an EU-organized enhanced forward presence? Why should it, in that sense? Then you have the other problems, is that can the EU has certain fissures on its own, and NATO has certain fissures on its own. So in this third sort of dark scenario, violating the Yogi Berra rule, a continued Canadian presence in Latvia and to NATO becomes more complicated, more complicated. If you suggest which one of these three scenarios I would go for, well, you know, as a Canadian, you know, who crosses the street to get to the middle, I would suggest that the first scenario might be the more likely, and that the Canadian contribution will, I think, certainly be renewed in 2019 and reflect Canada's continuing commitment to a valuable alliance, and one that has served Canadian interest well. As we suggest in the paper, NATO has survived not only because it had adopted very good defense posture, but flexible response has described not only its NATO approach to its military posture, but the way it runs itself. As a collection of democracies, flexibility, political compromise over perhaps what appears to be military rigor has always worked. It's working now in the enhanced forward presence, which, as we described, the command arrangements would somewhat convoluted, but that's not important. It's that they work. And in this sense, I think the Canadian commitment to NATO and NATO itself will serve Canadian interests well as Canadian values. But those two other scenarios are, I think, are out there and are worth contemplating as we discuss what the future of Canada's commitment to the enhanced forward presence in Latvia is. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Dr. Stephen Blank to the podium, but first a couple of words of introduction. Dr. Stephen Blank is a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. Previously, he was professor of Russian National Security Studies and professor of National Security Affairs at the Strategic Studies Institute of the U.S. Army War College. Dr. Blank has published over 1,000 articles and monographs on Soviet, Russian, U.S., Asian, and European military and foreign policies, and testifies frequently before Congress on Russia, China, and Central Asia. Dr. Blank. Welcome.
Thank you, Shuv. I'd like to thank the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and the Latvian Embassy for organizing this splendid affair. When I used to work for the Army, and before that the Air Force, I used to have to say whenever I spoke at something like this that my views do not reflect those of the U.S. Defense Department, the Army, or the U.S. government. That's still true, even though, like Donald Trump, I'm a native New Yorker. And that's why I know him. I'm to talk about the Russian threat. And that threat, going on from where Joel has left off, I think is a threat that is going to last a long time and is not solely bound up with Vladimir Putin, although it is bound up with the system that he has created and which I think for some time will outlive him when he leaves office, although I do think it also will come under enormous pressure and change in the future. What we have to understand is that as long as this system governs Russia, we are in a state of siege, to use an old term from Russian socialism, actually, with Russia, because the Russian government defines itself as being in a state of war with the West. This state of war did not begin in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, but at least 10 years before that. And the pressure on the Baltic states goes back to the 1990s. I just found last week the British government declassified some documents from the 1990s, and the diplomats quoted there refer to the increased pressure of Russia upon the Baltics, 1995, when Russia was much weaker and there was much more optimism about where things were going in terms of Russian European security. The fact that we have an autocratic neo-imperial government, and the two go together in Russian history, mean that we're going to have this conflict. And this is a conflict because Russia wants there to be a state of conflict or perceives it to be the case. There is nobody in NATO who prefers a state of conflict with Russia or who would, until the invasion of Crimea, necessarily say that we're in a state of conflict with Russia. But in 2005, on January 18th, Defense Minister at the time, Sergei Ivanov, told the Academy of the General Staff, the long-range thinking outfit for the General Staff, that Russia is in a state of war with the West, even though it's not shooting at anybody and that nobody's shooting at Russia. But this is a war in which other factions are trying to undermine Russian security, and among them, Russia's imperial thrust. The reason he says this in January 2005 is because at that time, they had failed in their first effort to suborn Ukraine. The Orange Revolution had taken place in Ukraine after Russia tried to corrupt and subvert the Ukrainian elections and kill one of the candidates. They failed. He ultimately won the election due to popular protest and what you might call a revolution. And as a result of this, the Russian government felt itself threatened by not only international terrorism, which is a real threat, but also by the West, because to the Russian elite, the greatest threat is not NATO military power. Indeed, they know full well that NATO is not an offensively capable force at the present, and certainly wasn't back then. Rather, the threat, if I may quote Victor Hugo, is an idea with bayonets: the democratic integration of Europe under Western auspices. Because democracy as such is the greatest threat to Mr. Putin and his kleptocracy. And they know it. And they've even said it on occasion. As Ivanov wrote in the Wall Street Journal in 2006, the greatest threat to Russia would be a constitutional upheaval in Russia or one of the states bordering it. 8 years later, we saw that, and here we are. As a result of that Russian viewpoint, the Russian government, an inherently neo-imperial phenomenon, believes that it cannot be secure unless its neighbors are insecure. And what's more, that its neighbors have no right to full sovereignty or to the absolute recognition of territorial inviolability and territorial integrity. This is not something that was invented in 2014. Again, if you go back and read Russian diplomats, Russian journalism, Russian officials speaking, every state east of Germany, not just the Baltic states, not just the former Soviet Union, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on, are all states that are not really sovereign. Their sovereignty is in some sense perforated, to use a political science term, or compromised. And their territorial integrity, despite all the treaties that have been signed since 1989, is not inviolate and can be revised if need be. So this idea of diminished sovereignty, which is the Brezhnev doctrine of 1968, and before that, Russian imperialism, without any doctrinal adjectives before it, remains the cornerstone of Russian foreign policy. And the idea that Russia can only be a great power if its neighbors are insecure and that their sovereignty is compromised lies at the heart of Russian policy, and therefore a state of conflict in Eurasia, not only Europe, but Eurasia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and so on, is inherent in the status quo. And that war, and I use that term advisedly because it's an act of force, even if it's a force by information means, to compel others to do Russia's will, as Clausewitz would say, continues to this day. The continued pressure on the Baltic states in this context has grown since the 1990s because, once again, they're not recognized as being fully sovereign. The argument is that they mistreat their Russian populations, and we can discuss that issue, but the Russian populations there, for the most part, don't seem to be feeling that they are oppressed, except unless Moscow tells them they are. And that pressure is expressed in multidimensional coercion. And as a matter of fact, multidimensional coercion, as a number of analysts, for example, the Israeli scholar Dmitry Adamski has written, is the nature of the Russian strategy. When I worked with the US Army, we had a construct for the instruments of power. It's an acronym, DIME, diplomacy, information, military, economics. You may have a different kind of construction, but this more or less captures everything. Russia is using the dime. Ambassador referred to energy boycotts, trade boycotts, use of Baltic banks for money laundering. We just had a scandal last week where it was revealed about Latvian banks, for example, but Latvia is hardly unique here. All you have to do is mention the scandals at Deutsche Bank and a couple of years ago where they got caught laundering billions of dollars to Russian clients. And they may get yet more exposure if Robert Mueller finds connections between them and one of their famous clients. They are also using banks in the Czech Republic. For example, the subsidies to the Front National, Marine Le Pen's party, went through a Czech bank, originally through Russia. It was tried to launder the money so it couldn't be traced. The Panama Papers showed a flourishing network of international corruption, of which Russia is a major player. Information war in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Sweden, in Finland, in European elections. France, Netherlands, Germany, Italy, United States, Mexico earlier this year. All are examples of what Russia is doing. And what's more, Russia defines information warfare in ways unlike the United States and, I imagine, Canada. And as a matter of fact, Russia has assiduously crafted a new strategy based on its own earlier Soviet strategic thinking and reconceptualization of the nature of the world and Russia's place in it, that information warfare not only refers to the penetration of the media and the use of fake news, trolls, bots, and all these other things that we are now learning about, not just in the United States, but all over the West, but as a systematic, protracted, unremitting attack on Western institutions and thinking. It is an ideological campaign, among other things, and it is an attempt to force Western populations to think otherwise or to lose any contact with objective truth. And it is attempting to use all elements of the media that are accessible to it, and of course, given the new technologies, those elements of the media are quite accessible to anyone who wants to do these kinds of things. So I've talked about economics, I've talked about the large-scale use of information in cyber strikes. They've also hacked into the American electric grid. They are also targeting communications, weapon systems, command and control, also through informational means. Russian diplomacy, as we know, is assiduous. It campaigns on a global scale, not just in Europe, Latin America, Africa now, if you follow the news, Asia, Middle East, as we all know, in efforts to advance Russian interests at the expense of the West and propose a different kind of view of the international politics and the international order. And then finally, military power. I want to spend some time on the military threat because we're, after all, talking about the deployment of Canadian soldiers into the Baltic. You can divide this section, if you like, into two aspects, conventional and nuclear. But you have to understand that nuclear and conventional weapons are inseparable in Russian thinking. Russia's new missile systems are dual capable, both conventional and nuclear, like the Iskander or the Kalibr. The nuclear weapon is a weapon par excellence for hybrid warfare. That's the term of art in the West. It happens to be one I don't like, but everybody's using it, so let that be. Because it allows Russia to carry out its strategy of limited incremental wars designed not only to advance Russia's power and influence in areas of critical significance to it, like the near abroad or Syria. It also allows Russia to use all those instruments of power that I've just described in order to deter and inhibit NATO from responding. Therefore, the nuclear weapon is a weapon not only that is going to be used in case of actual conflict, where they may go first, drop a nuclear weapon somewhere, and then force the Allies to negotiate on that basis. It is used as a weapon of escalation control throughout every phase of an international crisis, from start to finish, including combat, if combat eventuates. Therefore, the nuclear weapon is also an information weapon, because the threat to use nukes first and the presentation of Russia as a state that is perfectly willing without inhibition to use a nuclear weapon against somebody else without waiting to absorb a blow conveys a psychological and informational threat to the other side as to the nature of Russia and the nature of the stakes involved, that perhaps it's not worth helping Ukraine or the Baltic states or Georgia or whoever it might be, because we're risking nuclear war. And there are plenty of people in the West who have fallen for this argument, as we all know. But it's also that the nuclear weapon's primarily operational purpose is to deter NATO military response, whether it be in a conventional local war or in a larger theater scale war in Europe, which is what a Baltic war would be. And you should understand that if there is a war in the Baltics started by Russia, it will not only involve Northern Europe, it will probably involve the North Atlantic and the Baltic and the Arctic. And that is of vital significance for Canada. I'm writing a book right now with a Canadian scholar on the Arctic, which is actually being funded by MLI, and it's very clear, if you go to Norway and if you go to Northern Europe and if you talk to Canadian and American military and people and experts, that they believe that a Baltic scenario invariably entails the Arctic. It's going to involve, therefore, not just ground and air forces, but naval forces, both surface and subsurface, and could escalate beyond that. And there's a lot of press lately about the Russian threat in the North Atlantic to transatlantic lines of communication. And again, that's a vital interest of Canada as well as of the United States. In the Baltic theater, Russia had conventional superiority in 2014 before the invasion of Crimea. It still has it. I would argue personally, and again, I'm not representing anybody's view but my own, that it is necessary for the alliance as a whole, and I'm not casting stones at any one state, but everybody, including ourselves, that we need to defend the Baltic states and Eastern Europe, because the threat is not only in the Baltic, it's also in the Black Sea against Ukraine and Balkan states. I've been to Romania, and they acutely feel threatened over there by an enhanced combined arms conventional deterrent that will not only deter conflict, but will thwart Russia's strategy of trying to win quick, fast wars or conflicts using either the threat or the actuality of local military power quickly deployed behind a nuclear shield in order to deter NATO, undermine the cohesion of the NATO alliance, and advance Russia's political, if not actual territorial boundaries as well. Therefore, the best way to deter Russia, in my view, is more defense spending on conventional weapons. We need to spend more also on nuclear weapons, but I think we're well able to do that. The real problem in Western military spending is not the 2% number. The problem, and I think as Joel and Eleanor and others in the room know, is the efficiency of that investment. I could spend 2% of my GDP a year on military and give it all to retirement pensions, and I would claim I've checked the box, but I've achieved nothing in terms of usable military power. Europe spends an absolute fortune on military power, and the returns are pathetic, to be blunt. This is not Donald Trump speaking. This is Robert Gates as well saying similar things during the Obama administration and many other analysts. If Europe wants to take the defense of Europe seriously, it has to reform its defense spending and procedures, and that's true for both Western and Eastern Europe, because I don't think any of these countries could defend themselves against Russia right now if it was a one-on-one combination and without the American contribution, and that's largely because of the inability to achieve efficient returns on defense spending. In our own case, we cut defense spending from 2011 until last year under sequestration. That was a mistake. I think we realize that now, and we're beginning to ramp up. But again, it's not just a question of a figure at the bottom of a legislative bill or a federal budget. It's what you get in return in terms of usable and credible military power. But beyond that, because the Russian strategy is multidimensional, our strategy needs to be multidimensional also. We need to export more gas to Europe. Not in order to take away markets as such from Russia, but in order to convert the gas business into something like the oil business. In the oil business, basically, I go to New York or Rotterdam, I tell the seller, I need to buy X million barrels of oil for 2018 or 2019, at whatever the market price is. We haggle, but at the end of the day, there's an agreement. I write a check, he sends the oil, end of story. It's a business deal, pure and simple. Gas, on the other hand, is a political affair, and you see protracted negotiations over pipelines and so forth. Now, it is true that Russia gets about 85% of its energy revenue from the sale of oil, but that's, again, a straightforward business. The real political issue is gas and LNG, and we're moving towards more gas and LNG prominence in the global economy, and therefore we have to do better, both here and in Europe, at thwarting Russia's efforts to use gas as a political weapon by which they can then leverage political and economic subversion of targeted states in the West. And the United States still has no effective strategy for countering Russian information warfare. Part of it is because the president refuses to sign off on one, as you all know. I'm not going to revisit that in detail. You can ask questions about that if you like. But it is necessary to have a strategy to thwart Russia's information campaign, bring the information war back to Russia like we did during the Cold War. And I remember as a student in Russia listening to VOA and Radio Free Europe, and with Russians, with Soviet citizens. And finally, we need a full-scale expose of the extent to which Russian money and corruption is infecting and has infected and will try to keep infecting our political systems, along with the efforts by the Russian government to infect our elections, which are going to take place in 6 months, and which they're still doing, as Dan Coates recently said. Therefore, the Russian threat is multidimensional. It's inherent in the nature of the Russian government as presently constituted and as will be constituted for several years to come, barring some miracle. And therefore, our strategy has to be one of multidimensional deterrence and multidimensional cohesion, rather the opposite of what happened here in Quebec Saturday. And the strategy needs to be implemented not just by Washington, not just by Ottawa, but by NATO. And it can only be done if there's effective, coherent leadership from Washington. That's the way the reality of the situation plays. I admit that the situation today does not look good, but one thing you learn very quickly as a scholar of international relations, and even Yogi Berra might have said it, change is inherent in the human condition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Blank. I want to invite all of our panelists to join us on the podium now. And as they make their way to their chairs, I'll introduce the two remaining folks that we have and who I will be turning to for their first interventions. So the first would be Richard Fadden, Dick Fadden, who was a National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister from January 19, 2015 to March 31, 2016. Previously, he was a Deputy Minister of National Defense from May 2013, and before that served as the Director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service from 2009. Of course, over the course of his career, Mr. Fadden has worked in a variety of different positions across the Government of Canada. I have a great pleasure to have had to know him and work with him in that capacity. Eleanor Sloan is Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science, where she specializes in Canadian and U.S. security defense policy. She is a former defense analyst with the Department of National Defense and author of several books and articles in the field of international security studies. Dr. Sloan was elected by the Senate to the Board of Governors for a 3-year term ending in June 2019. Thank you all for being with us. I'm going to be moderating from this podium over here, so don't pay too much attention to me, but I'll make myself known when I need to be. I'll start with Mr. Fadden. We've heard comments this morning on the range of threats that Russia poses to NATO and how NATO is grappling with our response. Could we get some of your reactions, please?
Well, I agree that Russia is a significant threat to Canada, but I think the greatest threat to Canada's ongoing commitment in one form or other to Europe, to Latvia, and to others is the fact that Canadians, generally speaking, do not feel under threat. I think that's one of the most important characteristics of our national security policy. We have 3 oceans and we have the United States, and fundamentally, we don't feel under threat. Canada, you'll know as well as I do, is a democracy. So this fact limits what governments can do or not do. I think it's relatively easy for governments, any government, I'm not directing this particularly at Mr. Trudeau's government, to organize an expedition overseas as long as there are not too many return trips to CFB Trenton, which is code for bringing back fallen soldiers. So until we explain to the Canadian public, and the Canadian public accepts, that we have 2 clear and unambiguous adversaries on the planet today, and I mean by this China and in particular Russia, until they accept, we accept as a country, that there's a real risk to Canada, to the international order, absent a catastrophic occurrence, which we all hope won't occur, it's very difficult for Canadian governments to continue to send Canadian troops overseas with more than the slightest risk of people being killed or injured. So I would argue that the biggest issue that we faced is not a policy issue, or it's not a definition of threat issue, and I agree largely with the professor. It's whether or not the Canadian public accept that we are at risk, that there's a threat to Canada by what Russia is trying to do in a variety of ways. And I think that government, parliament, academe, and the media spend far too little time talking about this. And I would argue as well that Afghanistan was an aberration, because in the minds of Canadians, and this is supported by a variety of polls, it was linked to 9/11. There is no 9/11 with which we can link what we're trying to do in Latvia or in any other country. So never mind the policy correctness, the threat analysis, if Canadians don't accept that we're under threat by all of this, governments, because we're a democracy, are going to be limited in what they can do.
Appreciate it. All right, Dr. Sloan, what are your views?
Well, I echo what Mr. Fadden said. Certainly we don't wish threats upon Canada, but because we don't have direct threats to Canada, there's difficulty in terms of military support. When you look at the proposal, Canada is more supportive of action in Europe. We're sort of expeditionary in culture, so we're more supportive than some of the European countries as well, so I'm optimistic in that regard. But I wanted to talk about what we've been talking about with the nature of the Russian threat, and echo many of the comments that were made by Dr. Blanken. I really feel like we are in the, I also don't like the word hybrid, but I'll use it. I feel like we are in an era of great power competition through hybrid warfare. And hybrid warfare means a combination of conventional capabilities, irregular forces, counterinsurgency, but also political warfare. I like that your acronym DIME, the diplomacy, information, military, economic components. And we're seeing China and Russia using hybrid warfare to pursue its objectives. The main characteristic of hybrid warfare is achieving your objectives short of actual all-out conventional war. And the reason I think that we're seeing this today is because the structure of the international system is changing. There is now scope for competition vis-a-vis Russia and China against the United States, more so than since the end of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons haven't gone away. Conventional capabilities are much stronger in the West, maybe not actually on the border, but the United States conventional military capabilities are very strong. And therefore, the window for how are you going to carry out your objectives for these great powers, not just Russia, but also China, is through hybrid warfare, achieving your objectives short of all-out conventional war through information means, through influencing the population, and through economic means, through all the things that we have already heard about. How are you going to respond? One of the main things, of course, is going to be building up your intelligence capabilities, early warning, alternatives to economics, and also continuing to build up your conventional and nuclear military capabilities.
Thank you very much. Even Latvia, where the Kremlin manufactures an ethnic crisis in a city near the Estonian or Latvian border, to which Russian troops are asked to intervene at the request of local Russian speakers. In the case of either an official or non-official response, how would NATO respond to such an action, Dr. Sokolsky?
Well, I think for NATO to respond, I think it would help us. It depends whether it was a NATO response as NATO, which would require some sort of consensus, which would be, by the time they got it, it would all be over. Or it would be more likely that the individual countries would take their own initiative. And if this here, something like that, this is where we raise the paper of what would the principal NATO allies do? If they weren't going to do it, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, if they weren't going to do it for Crimea. I think that's an open question, but NATO's lived with these doubts since 1949. As much as Article 5 is touted, it was always a question about whether it would work under certain circumstances. If the Russians, the Soviets had gone into Norway, would the Turks have joined in? And there was a certain amount of that, as I mentioned at the beginning, I got plenty of nothing, and it ain't necessarily so. But
Right.
I think it would depend on the administration and how egregious it was. The NATO shot its full in terms of sanctions on Russia. I know I'm dodging the question because I think the alliance would like to try and dodge a concern.
I see Dr. Blank might have a view.
Well, I'm reminded of having grown up in New York with Yogi Berra. Prediction is difficult, especially about the future. Look, for NATO to act qua NATO, the North Atlantic Conference has to get into that. That's 28 states. There may be more. Macedonia will probably be a member soon. That takes time. Depending on the nature of the provocation in a place like Narvo or perhaps on the Latvian border, I think you'll see a faster individual response and maybe NATO coming in afterwards. It also depends on the nature of the provocation. However, what is striking to me is that despite the fact, and Joel's quite right, that we have almost 70 years of people writing, looking for reassurance at every moment about NATO, the Russians have not tried it. They didn't try it any time since the 90s, and they didn't try it in Germany, and other where they, or in, say, in Turkey during the Cold War. So I think we have to continue to hold by the two classic functions of NATO, as Michael Howard described them 35 years ago. Deterrence, which I talked about, and reassurance. I don't think we're doing as good a job on reassurance as we can, and I don't need to explain to you why I think so. But for the moment, Secretary Mattis has reassured a lot of doubters in NATO. President Trump, however, keeps undercutting his own policy that way. But the fact of the matter is that the stronger and more robust, I believe, conventional deterrence is, the less possibility there is for Russia to start something that it thinks it can control exclusively by conventional means. And therefore, that's why I argue for a greater and more robust NATO conventional deterrence to thwart not only the threat, but Russia's overall strategy.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to Mr. Fadden. Over the past years, CSIS has warned about Canadian politicians being compromised by the Chinese government. You've been specifically rounding the alarm on this particular threat. We know that Russian intelligence has escalated their operations in Western states, both in scope and in terms of aggression. Murders in the United Kingdom are one example. Should Canadians be concerned about Russian intelligence services doing the same here? And what types of level of activity should we be expecting as we approach the federal election?
Excuse me, I too have a cold.
Oh. We suffer together.
Yeah, I think we should be. I think it's generally accepted that the level of Russian intelligence activity in the West today is at the same level it was at the height of the Cold War. And we tend to forget the level that it was at during the Cold War. It was significant, it was across the board, and it was probably more effective than a lot of us knew. So Russian intelligence as well is quite dispersed. It's not directed exclusively at the United States or France or Germany or anybody. There are indications that they've directed a number of a bit of their attention against Canada. I think there's less evidence than has been the case in the United States and France in particular, but we clearly have to worry about it. I know the Canadian government has taken a number of steps to try and ensure that our election will be sans Russian influence. But I think that's in fact virtually impossible to do. We can secure our electronic systems, we can make sure that people don't stuff in the modern way ballot boxes, but there's no way that a single government can control what's on the internet. It's just not possible. And if you think about some of the things that the Russians and the Chinese have put on the internet in one shape, form, or another, giving the impression that somebody else has put that on the internet, it's really quite mind-boggling. We have a preoccupation in Canada and in the West generally about fake news. I think we're seriously underestimating the danger of fake news because people pay attention. They change their votes, they change to whom they're giving money. And anybody who thinks that Canada is immune to this, I think needs to up their meds. I mean, we are simply not immune to this sort of thing. So the United States may face a slightly greater risk in terms of elections, of the way they manage their elections from a technical point of view, but I think the risk in Canada to false information being used is as great, if not greater.
Thank you for that. Dr. Salt, what are your views on this? Because you see a lot of this type of debate happening in campuses around the country and how there's some sort of equivalence between facts and fiction, which usually is not even on the same scale. I'd be curious what your reactions are on this as well.
Yes, I mean,
Sorry about that. Excuse us. I think we're doing okay.
there's a concern for sure. And people pay attention, people change their votes, people might believe the news, but I also think there's a trend in the opposite direction, just because, ironically, there's been so much coverage of the fact that there is fake news out there that people are starting to question what they see. And this is what I see among the students that I'm teaching, is that they question what they're hearing, they're questioning whether or not that's true. And so the glass half full perspective on what Mr. Fadden was just saying is that perhaps the new generation won't just necessarily take what they hear and see it as truth.
That's helpful. We have about 30 minutes left, and at this point we'd like to turn to the audience for their questions. So I'd like you to start thinking a little bit about what kind of question you'd like to pose to our distinguished panel here. I'd suggest we take a few questions at a time and then pose it to the panel collectively so that they can't be cornered into something they don't want to answer right away, but I'll help you as your ally. So if there's any questions, I'll start with the gentleman in the back. Please put up your hand, I'll call on you, and then we'll turn back to the panel. Sir?
Mr. Fadden, you said something very interesting. In Canada, we do not feel threatened. What can we do to make the Russian public not feel threatened? And can we use this as a soft power to resolve this impasse? Obviously, they feel threatened. That's why they are backing their government. But if in some way we can make them feel not threatened, perhaps they will change the government.
Okay. Question number 2, sir?
Yeah, Andrew Schultz again. So on that, but kind of more or less talking about fears, more interest. So the Russian interest, it was the Tsar's interest, the Soviet interest, and now it's the post-Soviet, the oligarch interest. In all those times, there tend to be ways where we're largely antagonistic, but there are times when we can actually work together. So my sort of throw out to the panel is that you know, is this the system that has evolved post-Soviet space in terms of the oligarchic system, which has fundamental disagreements with our Western view of the world, but there is an economic interest. I mean, they do invest in London, and there is an economic interest. So my point of view, looking at it from a Russian interest point of view, do we see a future tomorrow where we can actually bring the Russians around somehow, and so we can actually maybe not be buddies, but coordinate a bit more and be less antagonistic?
Thank you for that question. Any more questions? Sir.
John Gilmore. The Latvian ambassador referenced the fact that the EU and NATO have to work closer and in tandem. The question from my perspective is how is the EU impacting politically on what NATO can and cannot do?
Thank you.
My question is, how should we or can build resiliency when educating our students about the role of NATO and gains NATO?
Okay, so let me summarize real quick. First is this idea of the Canadian public being threatened. How do we make sure that Canadians have a better sense of that threat from Russia? Am I not catching that correctly?
No. We are not threatened in Canada. That's why we don't feel.
So Russians will feel less.
So what can we do to assure the Russian people, not the government, but
Thank
the
you.
Russian people,
How do
that
we?
they are not?
Thank you for your clarity. So how do we make the Russian people feel less threatened by our own contributions? The second is on economic interests, and could that be basis of common ground and common language, especially as oligarchs look to have a better partnership. Third is the NATO relationship and how the European Union plays in bolstering that. The fourth question I didn't hear too carefully, but I want to make sure I got it right. It's Turkey and the S-400 system, the missile defense system, that they're negotiating purchase from Russia right now, and whether Turkey could be a reliable partner of NATO while it's doing business with Russia. I think it's a great question. And then the fifth and final question was building resiliency and how to educate people in schools and how we can do that in Canada better. Okay, I'll turn to the panel. Are there anybody that want to take a first stab at it? I'll turn to take that.
Well, let me start with the first question because I think it's a good one. I don't think the timing is particularly good for reassuring the Russian public. But I don't agree with Mr. Trump on very, very many things. But one thing that he said, which I do agree, is that not talking to countries is not helpful. So we have diplomatic relations with Russia. We have some economic relations. I think we should ratchet up those areas where there is a commonality of interests. Search and rescue, humanitarian aid, scientific research in the Arctic, all sorts of things. Canada used to have a moderately robust public diplomacy capacity, which it used around the world. It's barely in existence today. But I've got to admit that while I think it's worth trying, I don't think we're going to get very far today. I think the Russian public have totally accepted Mr. Putin's view that the West views Russia with an attempt to do something harmful. And I don't think we're going to change that in the short term. But I do think that more dialogue is important, more exchanges. Anything that we can do won't help, won't hurt. But again, I don't think we're going to get very far. Excluding Russia from, all of the various and sundry international multilateral organizations that exist is not helpful. I don't think they should be readmitted to the G7, but there are all sorts of organizations. So you've got to work both ends, the Russian public and also the government of Russia. But I think fundamentally today, this is not going to be, something that's going to meet with a great deal of success. Trying to reach them through the equivalent of Radio Free Europe or something is not going to work. They control, the government of Russia controls access to their internet, so the use of the internet to try and get to Russian people is significantly limited. It's going to be an uphill battle, I would argue.
Thank you.
Well, if Mr. Fadden doesn't mind, I'd like to take some issue with that. First of all, it will be an uphill battle. There's no doubt. But the effort has to be made in a strategic way to break the information barrier that Putin has set up. And that barrier is 20 years old because he started the minute he came into power. First of all, about the Chechen war. So that needs to be part of a broader strategy. And it has to be undertaken understanding that it's going to take a long time. It's not going to be enormously successful at first, and may never be enormously successful, but it will have an impact over time. And that's first point. Second point is this idea of that. First of all, we're in dialogue with the Russians. It's not really known, but there are plenty of opportunities. I'll give you some examples. I admit, I had dinner with Sergei Kislyak. I say it now in public. The ambassador to Russia. In March, we had a dinner at an ambassador's house. It was obviously off the record, and there was an attempt among the people who were there, four ambassadors, media, myself, other Russia experts, to find what the basis was for U.S.-Russian dialogue and cooperation. I assure you that everybody in that room tried to find one. There wasn't any. Anything meaningful about it. Yes, search and rescue at sea, yes, things like that, yes, but nothing meaningful. Because the Russian government insists on its point of view being accepted as a precondition for a summit. Now that Putin is looking for a summit, I was always skeptical about these summits. I'm more skeptical even after yesterday because I see how he performs. And the problem is that the West has not sufficiently integrated its means of power into a strategy that would compel Russia to say what it's going to give up. It's not just a question of Crimea and the Donbass. Every arms control agreement that has been signed has been broken. And I believe even the New START treaty is being broken as you look at the Russian nuclear missile construction program that's underway now, because the numbers don't add up. The State Department, for its reasons, may not be wanting to say that, but if you look carefully, I think they've even broken that. So if there's to be a summit, let's say about arms control, which is historically where Russia and the United States have been able to find agreement, even that is a moot point. The fact of the matter is that Russia sees itself at war with the United States, and it sees itself as winning, not as losing. And until you get somebody in Moscow who realizes that the costs of what they're doing outweigh the benefits, this dialogue is not going to be of great value. I spoke at a conference in Berlin in September about conventional arms control, and they asked me to say, does Europe need conventional arms control? This was in Germany. Sigmar Gabriel, who was very pro-Russian, was foreign minister at that time. And I got up and I said, it's true, Europe doesn't need conventional arms control, but it needs peace. And there's no peace. And a summit during war may have some benefit for optics and op-eds and elaborate stagecraft, but in terms of advancing Western interests, I'm rather skeptical. So I take it from a different point of view. We need to use the information capabilities at hand to begin this work. And while we have lots of dialogues with the Russians, they are really an exchange of views because there's nobody on the Russian side who's really prepared to have a genuine dialogue with the United States.
The government enters the markets, it's a big Russian threat, we got to spend. If it was only the government talking, that would be fine. But I think you're going to get pushback from other quarters of the country that it's, including the Treasury Board, that we are not going to spend more on defense than we're spending now. We've had a defense review. You rejected the 2% solution. We're not going to be more in terms of GDP for another 10 years, and we're just going to have to work, work within that, unless it's an extraordinary event, which I agree with Afghanistan. Another point, and this relates to the question about the EU and all, and maybe it was just me, but I remember when we used to have G7s or G20 summits, and the streets were packed with left-wing protesters denouncing globalization. Maybe I missed it this time. But the irony is, much to, I think, the surprise of the left, the threat to globalization is now coming from the right. It's undermining it. And it's coming from some of the countries, particularly in East, this is what I mentioned in terms of Eastern Europe, the rise of nationalism, of ethnicity. I think when I was a long time ago, somebody described fascism as the great surprise of the 20th century. Everybody was looking left after the Russian Revolution, and suddenly fascism came, and that was the surprise. I would say that nationalism and anti-globalization, and in its virulent forms, is the great surprise of the early 20th century. And what this means for Canada is, and Canada and the other G6 they've become the fans of globalization, of the liberal international order, and the threat is coming up. I'm not talking about the United States, because I think that's basically global. But the threat, including the threat to NATO internally, is coming from the right. In addition to the Russians, it may be hard to convince the Canadian government to back a NATO, as we now see in some countries, universities are being closed, elections aren't being run fairly, the judiciary is being corrupt. But I just find it interesting that the fears of globalization that were propounded on the left are gone. Now the threat is coming from the other. It's coming from the other side, and it's virulent because it's linked to the sort of ethnic nationalism which basically Canadians went to Europe to stamp out. And that, I think, is a problem. But as far as the budget goes, the Canadian public, cannot be convinced without a very strong case that there is a compelling immediate threat for which you have to spend more defense. Frankly, I'm surprised the deployment to Latvia went off with such little controversy. One of the things I was discussing earlier is that the great thing about Canada, as far as being a good ally, is the government, which has a majority government, can just make a decision and do it. We elected a government, it made a decision, you have 450 troops in Latvia, it's done. Had it been more controversial, then there would have been more, the government would have had a more difficult time. But I think it's suggested in our paper, it was actually not a difficult decision, although we like to talk about it and make it look like it is a decision, but it's probably going to be done in the end. But more than that, I think you're pushing the envelope, unless there's a major threat. An immediate threat.
Thank you for that. Dr. Sloan?
I'll tackle a few questions. Unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to the Turkey BMD question. But how to reassure Russia, feel that it's not as threatened. Whenever I think about that question, I come back to the Harmel report back in 1967, which gave NATO two ways of addressing the threat, and one was building up military capabilities through deterrence, and then secondly, reaching out, the outreach side. And so it's a matter of what balance we're at currently, what would work in the current environment. We're probably more in a build up the military capability because it's not a responsive environment in Russia, but we need to continue to focus on the outreach that we've already heard a little bit about here. On the EU-NATO side, a great question. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, of course, great competition between NATO and the EU, as the EU wanted to build its own military capabilities. And now, ironically, with the return of the Russian threat, the EU and NATO are cooperating closely to deal with the hybrid warfare aspects that I talked about earlier. So that's another component of the response, is dealing with the economic growth, the integrated nature of the Baltic region, and alongside the military capabilities. And I know that there was just a defense ministerial last week, and there was some sort of a joint announcement between the EU and NATO cooperating to deal, rather than, there was quite a bit of competition, if you like, throughout the 1990s, early 2000s. I just wanted to briefly tackle the question about what happens. I believe the question earlier was what happens if there's actually a bigger threat to the Baltic region and what we would do. A slightly different perspective from Dr. Sapolsky in terms of what would the Canadian response be. Again, perhaps more glass half full. I think that the Canadian response would be supportive of sending troops and increasing our contribution to the Baltic region in the event of an even bigger threat. That's what I would predict. Again, you don't want to predict about the future, but that's what I would predict. And the reason I say that is when you look at the strong, secure, and engaged defense policy that came out about a year ago, when you look in there, you see that, and if you remember that when Trudeau came into power, he talked about the United Nations and his $600 peacekeeping troops and a focus on the UN, and then that changed. And what we did was we, instead of sending a large contingent somewhere to an African country or another country that needed stabilization, peacekeeping, we sent the contingent to Latvia. And so ultimately, I think that Canada will go back to its traditional outward-looking focus on Europe in the event of a larger threat. And we've seen that already in the policy change with this particular government.
Can I disagree a little bit? I think one of the difficulties I have in talking about what Canada will or will not do is I think that we have an exaggerated sense of our capacity to influence events around the world.
No.
Yeah.
That's not fair. That's not patriotic.
But I think we have to be realistic. And, Eleanor may well be correct that our instinct will be if something happens in Europe to do something, but alone we will do and accomplish nothing. It will require some measure of an alliance response, or it's not worth our doing. It would be, in my view, foolish for Canada to send troops to Europe in the event of some event if the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany weren't involved. I think it's just practical reality. Which brings to mind, again, the issue of the management of the alliance, which I think severely needs some work. Someone mentioned a little bit earlier about how slow it is to get anything out of NATO. I don't think it's politically possible to delegate much more authority to Supreme Allied Commander in Europe than he has already. But it is so slow that has to be painful. And to the question about EU-NATO cooperation, I think cooperation is great. But if this cooperation means that we need a consensus between the two, we should all just, pack up and go home. It is hard enough to get a decision out of NATO than to ask at the same time that some measure of consensus also obtained with the EU. I think the earlier view of the EU staying out of national security was the correct one. Well, that's just my view. Others may have a different view. It's hard enough to get NATO to do anything. And if I can just take a second to address the Turkish question.
Thank you. I was going to go back to that.
I think in the medium to long term, there is no strategic interest for Turkey to develop an alliance with Russia. There may be some short-term advantages, not the least of which is to acquire something they need, not the least of which is to poke at the West, with whom they are irritated from a variety of perspectives. But I think in the end, Turkey's interests lie more with the West than they do with Russia. And in fact, it may lie in Turkey being relatively independent. But I think the West deserves a significant measure of responsibility for the way that Turkey right now is thinking. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the West basically said to Turkey, well, this is all very interesting. You're a member of NATO, and we're not going to really think about what you are and what you want to do. I have an immense army, not quite as efficient, say, as the U.S. Marines, but they're quite a significant contribution to make. I think, Eleanor and I and others were saying we should court the Soviet Union, or we should, thank you, Floyd, we should court Russia. I think we should also court Turkey systematically and on an ongoing basis to bring them back within our ambit. Now, I don't know to what extent that's possible. Their current leader is not exactly an easygoing guy. But in the end, I don't think their strategic interest lies with Russia.
Blake.
I realize I overlooked your question about Turkey. If you look closely at the Russo-Turkish relationship, it is much more complex than your question would lead people to believe. It is true they're buying the S-400 and the indications they may want some other weapon system. Why do they want the S-400? Well, for one reason, apparently, as an air defense system, they want to be able to defend against the Air Force launching another coup on airborne. That tells you something. Not reported in the Western press, but I've talked to people who know Turkey who say that. Second, Turkey has a very large defense industry of its own, and it is a significant arms exporter. And anybody who has responsibility for the Turkish economy and foreign policy is going to try to promote that. And that's another way of getting technology and capability that can be used for arms export. You see nothing about this in the West. That's our fault for not reporting it adequately. Third, as Mr. Fadden said, you know, some of the things that have happened in Syria are the United States' fault. I mean, yes, we've supported the Kurds. We had good reason, but we didn't work with the Turks to allay their fears about Kurdistan, which I think may be exaggerated, but nonetheless have to be dealt with. And you know, nobody likes being ignored, especially when they can turn to another suitor on the other side. That's true in life as well as in politics. Fourth, the Turkish government has not suddenly taken leave of its senses with regard to what Russian capabilities and threats are. They're not leaving NATO. The base in Incirlik has not been turned over to Moscow. On the other hand, they are extremely difficult to work with. They've always been difficult to work with, even before Erdogan. I remember when I worked for the Army. Mr. Fadden's absolutely right. It is one of the greatest assets of the Western alliance that Turkey is a member. The EU made a horrendous strategic mistake a decade ago, not bringing the Turkish negotiations to a definitive and positive conclusion, taking Turkey into the EU. Many of the problems we now face in the Middle East might have been alleviated were that the case, like refugees, if you want. It is still necessary to find a way to have a modus vivendi with Turkey from the EU point of view and from Europe's point of view and from NATO's point of view to deal with problems not only in Europe, but the Caucasus and in the Black Sea. And there has to be an understanding of the fact that if there's a school of thought that we have to have dialogue with the Russians, who after all define themselves as our enemies, a fortiori, you need to have a dialogue with the Turks who are your allies.
I have so many questions, but I don't have the opportunity to ask them, so I'm going to go for one more round with the audience here and see if I can sneak something in. Sir.
My name's John Gann, and there's a historic, fundamental paranoia associated with Russia, and it's been there for hundreds of years, and that is it's a very large country, and it's got notable countries around its border that presents an instability, and this paranoia is based on wanting to secure its own borders, and how best to do that is very often to go on the attack.
This is a Russian paranoia.
This is Russia, yes. And certainly Latvia and other countries like Germany and the Netherlands, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, are part of a geography which is the North European plain, which has been an entranceway to and fro Russia and back and forth for many, many years, and has created many hostilities over the years with wars.
Your question is?
Has there been any attempt to look at why Russia does why it does because of this paranoia?
Thank you very much. Question?
Yeah,
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
George Jacobi, retired diplomat. I worked on NATO in happier times in 2004 under Paul, where there was a NATO Russia cooperation and NATO Ukraine cooperation, and so I'm interested in how we might get back to that happier situation, and the role of Canada as acting as a mediator. There was already a question on what role Canada is playing in the Minsk process, and it would be great if our global affairs colleague could give us some information on that. But I'm thinking of a sort of a Canadian initiative on nuclear disarmament, which would see us trying to put some negotiating room, or establish some negotiating room between Russia and the United States to prevent this overwhelming nuclear modernization and escalation in nuclear rhetoric, and reinforce the non-proliferation treaty, particularly at a regional level. Could not Canada take a role in that and develop some mediation at the same time between Russia and NATO?
Thank you for that. That would be a difficult conversation to have in the context of nuclear proliferation in North Korea and Iran these days. But a fantastic question. I'll come to you, and then I'll come back to you.
Yes, my name is Mike Logan. I'm in the Canadian Forces. Question about the multidimensional response that you referred to, sir, and to building up resiliency against information warfare. How does Western liberal democracy respond in kind to an authoritarian model without undermining the strengths that we find in Western liberal democracies?
Thank you very much. That's a great question. Sir?
Yes, I'm curious as the Baltic states themselves, what their military capacity is to actually hold off a threat such as you suggested. If they decided some kind of border state, the Russian citizenry had asked for help, and whether they have their own internal agreement that they would all come to each other's aid if that should happen. So do they have the capacity to give enough time to hold off a Russian invasion or whatever you call it, to give NATO and the European Union time to actually organize themselves?
Great question. I'll leave it at those for now. Russian paranoia in the near neighborhood for Russia, what can be done to address that? Second, Canada is a mediator when it comes to the question of nuclear proliferation and ways to reduce that threat. Third, multidimensional response to authoritarian states, and that was a great question. One of our own colleagues at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Marcus Kolga, has written about how in Canada, the government of Canada can stand up a media communications center to dispel Russian disinformation as it happens in real time. It was a fascinating article I suggest people check out, but that's struggling with the same question. And then fourth, Baltic states and current military preparedness. We know that there are already tests on the Baltic region by Russia today when it comes to commercial assets in the Baltic region, the coast along Sweden and some other areas. So we'd be curious to see what your reactions are fairly quickly. We don't have that much time left. Of course, we have a reception to follow in the room next door, but I'll allow conversation to continue at that point. I'll turn it over to the panelists. We'll start from the far end and work our way back. How's that? Go ahead.
I'm just going to respond to a few things. In terms of democracy, how do you respond? The best way is to practice democracy. I mean, you just practice it. There is, Walter Russell Mead's notion of a Jeffersonian tradition believed that how do you defend the United States is preserve liberty and democracy at home. There are foreign policy implications, but I think the West not only won the Cold War because it had military, but it had the faith and it actually practiced democracy, and it worked. This is why I'm concerned about the threat to globalization. Just on the question of mediation on atomic weapons, I would say that's a no-no for Canada at this point. I don't see any prospect of there being meaningful arms control, and I think we just irritate a lot of people if we launch an initiative similar to the one that the current Prime Minister's father did in the early 1980s. Nobody who has the weapons is going to be convinced by Canadian diplomacy to give them up.
Thank you.
Very quickly, response to the question of dealing with authoritarian governments. You need to have a strategy, but it has to be a strategy based on telling the truth, the unvarnished truth. The truth, simply that. Truth shall make you free. It will, over time. Because I saw this in myself in Moscow, and the government in the Soviet Union was every bit as impressive as we have now. It is not beyond our technological and mental capabilities to come up with a strategy and capabilities to penetrate, breach Putin's, quote, iron curtain or internet curtain. Second, as far as Russian paranoia, I'm sorry to say that you have bad history here. As Richard Pipes, who just passed away, wrote, the Russian government commissioned a study in 1898. It turns out they started more of the wars than anybody else did. NATO's expansion was not a threat to Russia. NATO, even today, would have difficulty getting out of Hamburg and Marseille to attack Russia. It is in the interests of the Russian government as presently constituted because it's the heir to the KGB and sees itself as surrounded by threats. But the reality is nobody in Western Europe wants to threaten Russia. Nobody is looking to do that. And if it had not been for the war in Georgia and certainly the war in Ukraine, we would be doing a lot of business with Russia and there would be a lot of intercourse back and forth on all kinds of levels. This is a unilaterally imposed delusion that suits the government in power. Now, it's true that just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get me, but in this case, the paranoia precedes the threat. There is no threat. And we all know that if you study NATO's real capabilities. And finally, about the Baltic states. The Baltic states have mounted individually, and I imagine collectively, as much resistance as they can, but they're not going to be able to stand up to a full-throated Russian offensive. And to be honest with you, at the present level of staffing and what appears to be strategic plans, neither can NATO. That's what the RAND study, and the RAND study was incomplete because it didn't talk about air and naval dimensions. But the Russians, according to, I talked to Canadian officers last week, Russia has air superiority in the Baltic. They will close the Baltic off. They will attack probably Swedish and Finnish territories as well if they're going to go to a full-scale war. The question, though, needs to be answered in terms of what is the specific threat against what you're defending. And as we talk about specific threats, we can match Baltic defense capabilities and then NATO defense capabilities to specific contingencies, because there's more than one contingency regarding the Baltic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Simon.
Well, I certainly can't add any more to what our Russia expert said on why Russia does what it does. I guess I'll just mention in response to the question from the Canadian military about liberal democracy and how can it respond, because it's a complex, multidimensional environment that doesn't sit well, I guess, with liberal democracies and the way we've always conducted warfare. It's very indirect. There's many dimensions. It's not direct. It's not black and white. It's very gray. It's often called gray zone tactics. And when it comes to the disinformation that we see out there, all we can do is respond, but not in kind. We respond in terms of correcting and giving so obviously we would not put out false information in response to false information, but we would correct the record and give the truthful scenario, and also put out information that is truthful, not false, just to provide information to the various publics. Not false news, but truthful news that's in accordance with our values, and that's the only way we can respond in accordance with our values in the long term.
But who will be the arbiter of truthful news? Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Just a couple general comments, I think. We've been talking today about Europe and North America. I think before we can come to any definitive conclusion about what is and is not possible, we have to look at the world at large. Because no country, and I include in this the United States, no country can deal with 4 or 5 major crises at the same time. We haven't talked about China because that's not been on our agenda. They are a major preoccupation for a large number of countries, and I think for the West. The Middle East is not exactly the most peaceful part of the planet as well. So as we think about what we can and can't do for Europe, I think we have to remember that governments generally, but in particular that of the United States, despite the Trumpian doctrine of chaos, have to worry about the planet more generally. So I just make that as a general, I meant to comment. In respect of, whether or not our Baltic friends could resist a Russian invasion, I think the answer is no, because I don't think NATO would either. I agree. But I think the prospects of a Russian old-style invasion are really quite limited, because I think the practical result of that would actually be to unify NATO and to convince us to actually do something about it. But there are any number of other things that can be done, ranging from the little green men that Brian talked about at the beginning, to cyber warfare, to a whole raft of other things. I think NATO was actually quite smart in putting NATO troops in Latvia and elsewhere, because I think Putin will think twice before killing Canadians, Germans, and Americans. I mean, that would be a significant occurrence, which we could not ignore in the West, because our democracies would force our leaders to do something. But I do think we need to be realistic as well about our capacity to respond. And in this respect, I agree with what was said earlier. The real problem with NATO is its mobility capacity. In the final analysis, if the United States decides that it wants to do something kinetic in a major way, it can do so. It cannot do so in 3 days. And the armed forces of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, they're not negligible but their mobility capacity is relatively limited. So I'd argue, not being a NATO expert, but knowing a little bit about it, we should really work on the mobility of NATO's military forces, and that's both strategic and tactical airlift. But at the same time, worry more about a non-conventional attack from Russia and deal with cyber, little green men, and a whole bunch of other things. And that's not something that we in the West have come to understand entirely yet. And we haven't developed, to use a military expression, the doctrine to deal with it. I think we should start talking about it more, both within our militaries, but also publicly, so that we have a sense of what's possible and not possible.
I couldn't think of a finer point to begin concluding this. Thank you, Vic. The doctrine of how we deal with these asymmetric threats posed by Russia. This is an initiative that we are launching here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute with this distinguished panel today, thanks to our friends and allies in Latvia and all of the contributors at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. As I wrap this up, I just wanted to take a few moments, first of all, to say to Joel, Stephen, Dick, and Eleanor, please, thank you very much for your profoundly important interventions today, for your thoughtful views on behalf of the room. I think we want to say thank you. For all the MLI staff, would you just kind of step out from the door and wave for a second? There's a lot of you. You do amazing work. We're grateful to you for helping to put this together. I know a couple of my colleagues, David Watson and Dr. Brandon Crowley, had to take off, but Dr. McDonough is there. So thank you, MLI folks, for putting this together. You guys are fun colleagues as always. And I wanted to thank the support staff here, room service, who provided some of the food and the comfort in being in this beautiful music room in the home of our institute, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So David, Ethan, and Michelle, thank you as well for your hospitality, as always. My name is Shuv Majumdar. I would be remiss not to tell you to go to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute website, contribute. We are a nonprofit. These things don't come easy. We want to be argumentative about Canada's place in the world, and every little bit helps. Stay tuned, sign up on our email listserv so that you know more about these types of events, not just on the issue of the transatlantic, but also the looming challenges of the Trans-Pacific, the Middle East, and elsewhere. We're delighted to have hosted you this morning. Please enjoy some refreshments. Thank you for your time. Thanks for coming. Everybody have a good day.